Welcome back to another book highlight. Now that we're up to chapter 3 in My Father the King, I'd like to talk about a character element that has actually been mentioned a couple times by now if you're reading along in the book or you already have read it. Why does Mephi cut himself? I think it's important to address the question of why would I add something that dark to a biblical character, and why specifically does it affect Mephi in this way? Now, at this point in the story, we know that he's been disabled his whole life. He's been hiding his whole life. He's been forced to beg, and he's been shamed and abused and told that he's cursed because of his grandfather's sin. And now David is being crowned king of all Israel, and Mephi is listening to all the leaders of his tribe basically talk about what they're going to do with him, since he's a dangerous person to keep alive. You know, they're not really quite sure what David's intentions are, and nobody really wants to be responsible for Mephi. But at this point in the book, the fact that he cuts himself has been mentioned a few times. So why did I include that? Now, as I said before in the previous videos when I talked about crafting a character, for biblical fiction, I'm mixing scriptural truth with my own ideas and what I know would be typical of a person in his situation or culture. So for Mephi, I was considering a lot of things that would have happened to a child growing up in war and trauma. And, you know, when I'm making a character, I'm trying things on for size, trying to figure out what fits with the story that's emerging and the major plot points of his life. And one of the first things I was considering for Mephi was a speech impediment, mostly because this is such a pervasive thing among children that grow up with PTSD from war situations, even today. And I kept a little bit of that in the story. He struggles to talk to or look at anyone besides his nurse. But at this point in the story, Mephi is a bit older. He's 13 and he's starting to carve. It's sort of a release for him, a hobby, and a way to remember bits and pieces of his old life with what he carves. He carves like the symbol of the tribe of Benjamin, which is a wolf. He carves like different Hebrew letters. But I also set up, out of that, it's sort of a backstory emerged about how he starts cutting himself and why. So basically the backstory I created was that his guardian, Ziba, has a bunch of sons who like to bully him. And one day they take his carving knife and start cutting him with it. And he's so humiliated that he starts doing it himself as a sort of desperate, rebellious way to feel in control of the torment. And this is a major theme that I actually found when I studied severe forms of bullying. So later on, I found a lot of agreement in other places with the emotional connections I was making about this. It fit the character. And that is the most important consideration when you're adding any kind of artistic license to a biblical figure. I knew that this in particular would be a heavy thing, this cutting thing, since the law of Moses specifically forbids cutting yourself on behalf of the dead, which is something that pagans would do in that day. And so it would have been forbidden. The life is in the blood and it's for atonement. So Jews in this era weren't supposed to cut themselves. So I knew this would be a very heavy thing to put on Mephi, but it fit with his character because he grew up as an educated prince of Israel for 5 years, but he hasn't lived that way ever since. He's been cast out and he's grown up very wounded and bitter, and so he feels very much cut off and removed from the heritage of his fathers. And he also has this deep inner self-hatred as well as a rebellious desire to take matters in his own hands. And all of that combines to express itself in the act of cutting. Now, when you are dealing with this kind of artistic license with biblical characters, especially if it's a negative thing that you're putting on them, something sinful or harmful that isn't expressed in scripture, you have to be very careful and you have to decide, is this something that I just want for drama, which would be kind of self-indulgent, or is there a reason that this fits the character? In this case, it fits Mephi's character, what has already been established, and it provides a tangible conduit for the redemption that's coming later in his life. It's a tangible expression that represents his self-hatred and inner turmoil right now, but it's also a little bit later the first evidence of his inner healing. When he starts to heal, he stops cutting himself. Now, after I developed the idea, I did some research and I found that I was understanding cutting correctly. Many times today, cutting is done as a social experiment or out of curiosity to try something destructive, but Mephi does it out of rebellious, helpless torment. So my research supported what I'd come up with, but I didn't just decide this out of nowhere. It developed with the character. I don't put things on them in order to add drama. As I was getting to know him as a character, this element showed up. It was almost like he told me, this is a part of my life. Does that mean I think it happened for real? No, but one of the telltale signs that it works is that after I start developing it, it's sort of blessed in the sense that it works. Lots of ideas fall by the wayside or don't work, but I knew this was okay because it fit the character. It holds water with the research I did later, but also God had an element of blessing in it that he revealed to me. I didn't realize until after writing this book that this element would be a major way to reach out to people who might have kept quiet about their own guilt or shame or addiction. For a chance for them to see the healing Mephi finds in the midst of his destructive behavior. His shame basically comes from fear of punishment, but when he meets God, who is perfect love, his fear and his cutting is cast out. So it's a major place where you can see tangible redemption in Mephi's life, and I'm so hoping it will help people who read this book. It's helpful when you're dealing with a big concept in a novel like redemption, to have something tangible in the life of the character that mirrors what's going on inside them. And that's what's happening here. The amazing thing about God is that you can face him with all of your mess and experience the depth of his mercy and redemption. And as Mephi reacts to this and learns to fight back against the enemy's lies with God's weapons of truth and kindness, I hope that every reader will experience God in this way for themselves and be encouraged and emboldened to take that next step toward him.